Hello. Yes, it works. Hi. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are joined by Kevin Henry, who is going to be talking about visualizing futures and looking at sketching and all aspects of sketching that include new tools yet to be explored. But first I just wanted to talk a little bit about Kevin as our guest. So Kevin is a host. No, we are the host. 4D Design is hosting Kevin Henry for this talk. I say this for the folks who will watch this later. He is a guest of the 4D Design Department at Cranbrook Academy of Art, and we're the first new department in 47 years. Our craft is form, code, and electronics that manifests in sound, light, and movement. And Kevin is a really perfect guest to be joining us because, first of all, his really seminal book, Drawing for Product Designers, has been something that I know I personally have been following for many years and has inspired and helped my practice. And there is an updated version of the book that includes sketching techniques that include time-based media and everything that you'll talk about this evening. So I know that we've been having a lot of great discussions around design methods for interaction. And so that also seemed like a really great fit for 4D, for Cranbrook, and for our extended audience. Kevin did a workshop with our department in the thick of the pandemic, thank you very much, which was amazing for us in the spring of 2021. So he's had an influence on the 4D Design Department for some time. And his background includes furniture building, performance, product innovation, and many aspects of design. So he's kind of an eclectic mix of many roads come to creative output like those of us here. So a little bit about Kevin's bio. He's a professor of product design and visiting professor in the fashion studies program, associate professor of design and visiting professor in the fashion studies program at Columbia College in Chicago. He teaches in the product development track, and he is a product and interaction designer and author. The second edition of his book that I just mentioned, Drawing for Product Designers, will be released, and your lynda.com course, Sketching for Product Design, was released in 2015. He's a recipient of numerous design awards, including the IDEA, Industrial Design Society of America Award, and the Good Design Award. And he's currently working on a series of interactive books, which maybe you'll tell us more about. So there's a lot more to say, but I will let Kevin take it from here.
Thank you, Carla. Thanks for the invitation. Let me just set my alarm here, so don't want to overextend my stay. I am Irish American, which means I can talk forever. Okay, all right, so there we go. So anyway, what I'm going to do, I'm going to move fairly quickly. I generally like to move around the room and shout, but since this is going to be video recorded, or is being videotaped, I'll stay here, but it's sort of hard for me to do that. I've spent altogether 10 years researching visualization, ostensibly figuring out ways to teach students how to visualize. So that was the first book which was published back in 2012. And then they came back to me and said, you know, we want to do an updated version. And an updated version is usually you just change out the images. And so I always do a lot of research. I do a lot of interviews. With the idea that the story emerges. I don't tell the story. I retell the story and through conversations with people like Carla, who was one of the people I interviewed. And what happened in writing the second version, apart from COVID, was that I realized visualization had radically changed. And I was trying to capture that, and it was really complicated because I don't really want to teach students a technique. I want to teach them a mentality. And so from the first edition and into the second edition, I've been really interested in cognition. And as you'll see in the presentation shortly. And so, you know, as we moved into AI and we moved into VR and all of those other things, it totally changed the story. So it took a long time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to lift the hood on some of the cognitive pieces. So there'll be less show and tell, because that's all out there anyway. And there'll be more of the sort of underlying logic of trying to piece together a super complicated story, which I will say, sort of at the outset, especially given the changes emerging through artificial intelligence, that I'd speak, like most designers, about sketching fidelities. And I think the low end, the low fidelity has been underplayed and undervaluated just because it tends not to look beautiful, pretty, technical, accomplished, whatever, however you want to characterize it. So I'm going to talk a lot about that and show some excerpts from the book and just kind of give you sort of an overview, fly through the book. So why do designers sketch? For any designer who's here, we know there's a lot of reasons to sketch. It could be communicating information, visualizing your own thoughts, capturing thoughts before they disappear, record facts, record fictions. All these things, once they start to layer one on top of the other, gives you this muddy sort of appearance. And that's the thing I really love about sketching, is that it's not a single thing. And it's not defined by a single thing. It's not defined by a technology. It's not defined by a mentality. It's just all of these things. My apologies if you can't read that. It's sort of the idea. So over the course of writing both of the books, I realized that I've become kind of an anthropologist of line. And of course, there are real anthropologists of line, like Tim Ingold. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this wonderful book. But what I do when I'm writing is I ask people to submit work samples, and then I just study those things. I just look at them. I'm looking at them as a practitioner as well as an educator, and I feel like it's a little bit of a Rosetta Stone. Like, why are they doing this? And why is this here? And why is this there? And so that's a big part of what I've tried to do with the book, is it's not, while there are technical tutorials in there, I'm really trying to tell a much more nuanced, complex story. Not complicated, complex. So one of the things, so this is the table of contents for Ingold's book, and I love this idea of up, across, and along. So this is a quote from just a person on Goodreads. Having read the book, having marked it up, I just want to go out and find a nice little summary statement, and this one did a pretty good job of it. But I love the fact that Ingold has combined writing, reading, singing, drawing, weaving. You can read all this. But also this concept of observation, hypothesis, and connection. Because, of course, one of my big heroes is Ray and Charles Eames, and I loved, this was one of the first sketches super early on that I saw, and I was like, that's just incredible. And yet, if you look at it, it is what it is. It's a visual, but it's got so much power. And when I'd reach out to startup companies, I'd say to them, like, would you mind, because I'm sure you've got documentation of your whiteboards, would you mind sharing those with me? And they would always say no, like over our dead body. And I came to realize that the reason they didn't want to share is that there's potential IP embedded in those crappy little sketches. So I think we have this tendency to undervalue the scrappy sketch because either we don't fully understand how to read it or decode it, or we just look at it at face value and assume that it just isn't really valuable. So again, the Eameses are doing that wonderful thing of not only sketching, but they're also annotating. It's one of the things that I've been preaching for a really long time with my students is your sketches need to talk, and they won't talk entirely on their own. You need to add a voice there, and it's so great to see in their particular case. Also, this idea that, things are not static, they grow and they develop. So when you've made a beautiful sketch, it doesn't really grow, but a diagram or a map, because you have to read it, you have to interpret it, and you're making it on the fly, and it's creating the opportunity for conversation, it does grow. So the other nice thing is that the Eameses take something as simple as a Venn diagram, which is a hugely powerful visual, because it helps us to think. It's a thinking tool. Simply by overlapping three circles and identifying what those are, you quickly see in that sort of Boolean logic where the overlaps are. You see double overlaps in 3 instances, and then you see a triple overlap. And so, I didn't put any terminology in there because I just wanted you to see sort of the pure visual, that this to me is so incredible. And then when you look at what the Eameses did, they sort of break the Venn diagram in the best way possible. So there's something happening not only between the space, but also the overlap. And these things, they have meanings. So back to Ingold with up, across, and along. So if we think of those 3 terms, we could illustrate them like this. And, we might look at this and say it doesn't really have meaning, and yet all of us can read that, and it does have meaning. A squiggly line or a dotted line versus a solid line, a vertical versus a horizontal, they all mean differently. And while it might be approximate, it's an instigator of conversation, and that's really what visualization is meant to do. It's not an act in itself, it's an active act that instigates conversation. So why is it that we don't trust them? I'm not sure. I've got my hunches, but I'm not completely sure. But one of the reasons is that I think we have issues reading things that have multiple ways of meaning. So I like to throw in a conundrum when I can, and I think this is a nice one. So when we look at this versus this, they're both simple visuals of time, and yet one is linear. And obviously one is circular. Now, anybody who creates charts or graphs understands the horizontal axis is usually temporal. It's almost always temporal. In part because we walk a straight line. We don't fly, we don't climb up. And so the vertical axis tends to be quantitative. But the circularity comes from the machine itself. And while this isn't, a medieval clock, it was McLuhan in Understanding Media who pointed out, that big transition. I won't read this, I'll let you read it. So I remember reading this as an undergraduate and just being struck by the fact, well, one, McLuhan's ability to uncover the logic of something and make sense of it. The other was that, that escapement, that wheel which regulates the rotary movement of the gears, changes the rotary motion, and it subdivides it. It breaks it into these little pieces. So it's quite an ingenious invention, and yet it's also something that, again, in McLuhan's analysis, changes the way that we understand and experience time. The time is not this fluid thing. There's actually this like tick, 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 or tick tock. So that's the escapement mechanism. It requires a pendulum, and the pendulum is what makes the sort of ratcheting mechanism propel itself. And as long as it's being pulled by gravity, by weight, it could theoretically go on forever if it was attached to a river or a stream. And so, the escapement gives us that. It divides time, but it also gives us that oral quality of the tick and the talk. I have no idea if there's any relationship between that, but makes one wonder. Horizontality, or the linear notion of time, is more like a walk cycle, and that's the thing that we normally associate with time, in part because of the way we're situated on the Earth, the way gravity works, the way our sense of past, present, future works. But circularity is the thing we look at every time we look at a clock. We no longer hear the tick-tock of the clock, but we've got two notions of time, one being cyclical and rotary, and the other being linear. So the question is, do all living creatures think this way? And my argument would be no. So squirrels, they move along both axes. They move along the vertical axis as well as the horizontal axis. So going back to Tim Ingold's chapter, they move both up and across. So again, we've got in our own visualization, we have this sense that up is always good, more is better than less, and that time is I'm running out of time, or there's time ahead of me, or the past is behind me. Now, you might all be thinking, like, what's he telling us here? This is all super obvious. It is obvious, but once you start analyzing sketches, you start to see these underlying gestalts, and you start to decode the simple ways in which marks get made in order to make sense of things. So I like to say, again, following Ingold's lead, that sketching is a trace of thought. When I sketch, I'm externalizing my ideas on a piece of paper or some sort of substrate, and I'm able to respond in that sort of Donald Schoen's reflective practitioner, or self-reflective practitioner, and I can make a mark and I can respond to it, and I can move along that process. Or what Joan Didion says is, I don't know what I think until I see what I've written. So sketching lies on this spectrum that I've always found super fascinating. And it's a spectrum that moves from low to high fidelity. And I would argue that we've spent less time. I'd say the interaction people spend a lot more time in the low fidelity sphere. And the industrial designers like myself spend more time in the high fidelity. I think as 4D and traditional 3D, product design and interaction design, meld more, because I think of UX as kind of stuck in this, in the worst case scenario, stuck in just dealing with mobile devices. But as smart products come into existence that are clearly physical products that don't just have a screen, the low and the high fidelity merging together is going to become a super important thing. All right, so I'm going to just go in and show you some of the excerpts, talk through how I developed a framework and tried to find a simple, continuous language that isn't necessarily my own, but it's drawing from a variety of different disciplines. So this is the sketching spectrum, and up in the upper right-hand corner is Jeff Bezos' famous flywheel diagram. And so I compare that with a quick little Shaper 3D model that I built, saying that, this is referencing, one is referencing the other, one operates in the physical realm, while the other one in the upper right is really conceptual. And yet, this is a legendary diagram in Amazon's archive, similar to, say, Herb Kelleher's napkin sketch of Southwest Airlines, which is basically just a triangle with 3 nodes. So here's the full spectrum going from the low fidelity end all the way up to the high fidelity end. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to say, look, they're all interrelated. They're all based on line, they're all based on spatial properties, while perspective relies on laws of perspective with vanishing points and horizon lines. It's still line, and there's a power in line, there's a power in space, there's a power in shape, and they just take different formats. If you're doing UX, you might be doing wireframes, you might be doing storyboards in order to imagine the experience, and then you're taking that and you're moving it through a series of methods to get to this other place. But I like to look at this and say these are all either siblings or cousins, but they're all interrelated. It's not that that is one thing and this is another. They're all absolutely interrelated. If you want to make a storyboard, all you really need is a box and stick an image in there that is changing, and our brain is automatically going to read it as temporal. And again, when I think about icons and the simplicity of icons or a variety of different diagrams, they not only have Gestalt properties, but they also have inherent visual properties that make them very strong, but I think they get short shrift. Whereas, these are kind of the heroic characters out of industrial design. So I started off by saying I try to position sketching not as a technical skill, but as a cognitive skill. And it's just a matter of, we might look at this and think this is more like boilerplate legalese. It's buttoned up, it's super detailed, super accurate, but it needs that other piece. It needs the crappy little strategic sketch, the basic little wireframe in order for this to come full circle. I looked at the notion of, well, what is the difference between products, interaction, and services, and how do these different ways of visualizing allow us to think through those 3 different scenarios. On the right-hand side, you see product. The second row, you see interaction, and then down in the third is a service. I looked at a lot of work by other people. So, and again, this is the sort of stuff that people will send to me, and then I spend hours just studying the sketches that went into the Book of Circles, which is a fantastic book. And this is an encapsulation of what's happening not only spatially and how we tended to use the strength of the horizontal and vertical axis to create quadrants, but also how we can move from one area to the next, and they're all absolutely interconnected. So here is the full sketching framework. And I'm talking from the standpoint of a product designer. An industrial designer is typically more involved in physical products, some interaction, but my background is really more on the physical and furniture and physical products, but I know that when I was a student, there was no time spent teaching me how to sketch abstractly, to sketch strategically, nor was there any real attempt to teach me to sketch temporally. It was all in this area here. So our profession, the industrial designers, I think really need to absorb a lot more of that knowledge and get over the issue of just because it's low fidelity doesn't mean it's sophisticated. It isn't sophisticated. The other thing that has been useful, especially as I'm running workshops, is I try to explain that we can drop something into a 2x2 matrix and identify low to high fidelity, fast and slow, and you can kind of chart it. And what happens is there's a sweet spot, again, for industrial design that is around 70-80%. You need to sketch fast because you need to get a lot of ideas out. You don't want to fall in love with any of them. But as you start to dial things in, it gets slower and slower as the accuracy increases. So at the upper left-hand corner, you're at the lowest fidelity, but it's also the fastest. And as you move along that spectrum, it just starts to drop. I looked a lot, and I'll talk a little bit about Henry Beck's map, as well as Kevin Lynch's spatial taxonomy. But again, it's trying to look at not only current technology like face detection algorithms, but also linking it back to people who are long dead and never saw the results of fMRIs of human brains, i.e. Kevin Lynch in his Image of the City book. It's a fantastic book, and it informs so much of my thinking despite the fact that he wrote it in the 70s. So again, I'm always trying to synthesize and say, hey, some of this stuff that happened was just incredible, and we don't want to throw that out just because there's newness. This is just a page showing what I always try to do is take the work of somebody's provided me and annotate it. So I'm trying to direct my viewers' attention to say, hey, if I just show you an image, you won't know how to read it. But what's actually happening is this designer's done this, that, or the other. And this is very different than the first book, because the first book didn't do any of these things. But I realized through workshops that I could teach somebody how to sketch perfectly well in perspective, but they'd only just kind of learned the skill. They hadn't really understood its power. And so that's really what this version of the book is all about, is trying to get them to understand the power. And then there's case studies. So this is Map Project Office in London. And again, this is laid out in the book. This is my layout. I always do everything in InDesign. I'm a bit of a control freak, and then I hand it off to the publisher, and then the graphic designer goes in and does a new treatment. But I do it because I'm trying to control the story, and I don't want X number of images 2 pages later. I want them there, and so it's just my way of sort of controlling it. But so here, Map Project Office does a lot of really interesting tech products. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at all of their artifacts, from the CNC prototypes to the mock-up UX in both of those instances, to 3D printing of the case. But in particular, I'm looking at their walls. So I was describing earlier that I get all these artifacts, and I'm constantly just looking because I'm trying to make sense of them, not look at them and say, oh, those are beautiful sketches, but like, why did you do that in that order? Why is this a hybrid of both sketches and photographs? And what's the nature of the Post-it notes? Are the colors really being used strategically? And I would argue in this case they are. Sometimes they're not, because you only have yellow Post-it notes. If you're in a studio where you've got 3 or 4 different colors, and you start to think about what color could have meaning, I think you're going to have a better brainstorm session. And then I went ahead and so their sketches I recreated those on an iPad, but that's kind of what their sketches look like. And then I went ahead and I created the traditional way in which you might do that as an industrial designer, simply to say, you're not getting any more information from my pretty sketches than you are from those less pretty. And I hate to use the word pretty, but I think you understand what I mean. Scrappy. And then I'll also do sort of a schematic analysis to just look at all the different artifacts and try to make sense of not only the artifacts themselves, the sketches, but where they appear in space. Are they hierarchically up at the top? Are they the largest? Are they overlapping or are they overlapped? Where are the post-it notes and how is all of this essentially chunking out the process to make it easier for the designers to think. So those gestalt properties that get leveraged, sometimes we intuitively understand them, but we don't necessarily spend the time to really fully harness the true power of those. This was another case study. And again, what's really beautiful about this is, I hate to sound like I'm always looking for sketches that are not good. I make good sketches, I can make good sketches, but I tend to try to say to people, like, the sketch porn that you see on Instagram is just sketch porn. Like, it's not, if it hasn't been made, it's just a sketch. And so you make sketches in order to make stuff. You don't make sketches to make beautiful sketches. And this is a great example because they're doing exactly that. They're doing these quick, low fidelity sketches in order to explore a range of different issues. But they're also going in and they're using writing. They're using visual images to help tell that story. And so as a result, they're not saying, oh, well, I want to always be showing my expertise in sketching. They're really thinking through and using all those visual tools to maximum effect. And again, then I go in and I do an analysis of the actual whiteboard. But you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, more sophisticated visualizations as they moved into CAD. And then, actual physical mock-up with the full boxing so that they can walk through the unboxing process. But this to me, again, someone might look at this and say, either it's obvious or it's not, but I don't think it is obvious. There's a lot going on here that really needs to be unpacked. And when I was being taught, I wasn't taught any of that. I was just, the emphasis was always to just try to do things in a skilled way. So again, that's just a form of chunking, and it's based largely on space, positioning, those classic Gestalt principles of hierarchy, location, proximity, how close or far away is something from something else. All right. So spatial temporal thinking, one of the people who's influenced me tremendously is Barbara Tversky. She was at Stanford. She's been at Columbia Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. She wrote a book called Mind in Motion. And her argument is that it's motion that really lets us understand the world. And like motion is one of the core things connected to cognition. This is an example, another case study from Salesforce, Nadim Haderi. Fantastic. This is such a fantastic set of images because it demonstrates. I'm not reaching out to people saying, hey, give me exactly this. I am saying, give me everything you can, warts and all. Like, don't hold back. If you're okay giving me a napkin sketch, I'll take it in a second. Sometimes designers don't want to give a napkin sketch because they don't want their name associated with a napkin sketch. I'm kind of like, that's where it all starts. And, we just need to pay more attention. But in Nadim's case, he sent me all this stuff. And again, it took a lot of analysis, but I could start to see these just beautiful patterns of how quick set of sketches over there led to something that feels storyboard-ish. It's got a lot of Gestalt properties in there just through the use of color, minimal use of color, but also compositional strategies. And then those get turned into, not that he did it, but he's creating the blueprint for the web designer and the rest of the team to go out and get the good images that would actually be in a full fidelity website and mobile device. So sketching is a process. It's not, I mean, it is an artifact, but I'd say more importantly, it's a process. So this is, again, a sampling of Nadim's work. And again, when I see something like this, and I'm glad that people do send me more stuff than they might think I'm really looking for, although I am quite explicit, like send me everything you can. I'll make a determination or I'll come back to you with questions. But here you see, the middle stage of that process instigating a conversation in the form of Post-it notes. And so it's not as though you come up with the idea, you develop it, and boom, it goes straight to production. It's that there are these in-between conversations, and those are probably the richest part of the design process. All right, so in my attempt to always look beyond sketching, I've just started listening to Jeff Tweedy's How to Write One Song. And because I'm doing everything like everybody else on a phone, I've been recently listening, because I read most books through my ears, and it just struck me that this is a wonderful example of some of the stuff I've been talking about.
What I'm trying to tell you, and what I still tell myself frequently, is that inspiration is rarely the first step. When it does come out of the blue, it's glorious, but it's much more in your own hands than the divine intervention type beliefs we all tend to have about inspiration. Most of the time, inspiration has to be invited. Process. To me, process is whatever act you can engage in, whatever steps you can take, and whatever device you have at your disposal that you can use together that reliably results in a work of art. Process is also the only name I know of for whatever series of contortions and mental tricks we have available to lose ourselves in when we create. It's the door to the disappearing that I've already described as my ultimate desired creative state, being able to get gone enough, long enough, for a song to appear. Beyond what it helps me create, disappearing is also the most sustaining part of what I do. It's the part that's long over with way before a record comes out.
So I love this concept of disappearing. And I think when we start to look at other disciplines and the way that they do what they do, and he spends a lot of time talking about how he wakes up in the morning and because he played some music then just before he went to bed, his ideas are clear, he pulls his phone out, he starts writing snippets, always just little snippets, or he might hum into his phone. And it seems like sketching is a very analogous process. It doesn't, I'm from Chicago, it didn't surprise me that in Chicago we refer to improv comedy as sketch comedy. You're going to hear, a Second City group potentially fail versus going to see a Shakespearean play. You'd ask for your money back if the actors failed. But we're perfectly fine listening to people who might just screw up because there's a magic in seeing something unfold in real time. So, back to the book. Again, I'm trying to tease out some of these things that might not be apparent without necessarily going overboard or becoming too didactic or too professorial, God forbid. And so when I think of Gestalt, I remember learning about Gestalt, I just wasn't interested in it until I started thinking about it a little bit differently. I should have left that on that slide, but we'll come back to something similar. Gestalt is when you're watching your favorite team and they're all in red and the opposing team is all in blue. You can follow exactly what's going on this really big scale. And yet, I remember when I was introduced to this concept, I'm like, who cares? But the minute you start to see gestalts in different, more obvious ways, suddenly you realize, like, yeah, those German scientists in 1919 were definitely onto something. So this is a Radio Flyer company based in Chicago, and again, you see simple gestalts of proximity and color usage that direct the eye in very specific sorts of ways. So we visualize all the time, everywhere. Imagine you're struggling with one of your coworkers and you've gone out for lunch. You're going to take everything that's on the table and you're going to say, my boss is an idiot, his boss is a bigger idiot, and my colleague is this or that or the other. We're going to take anything that we have and we're going to just start moving it around the table. It's almost impossible if you are at a diner table and you're discussing something that's driving you nuts that you're not going to start picking things up and moving them around. I use this from a mini 5-week class I teach called Ideation Sketching. For those of you, I'm sure we're all familiar with the visual, but it's referred to as a crazy wall, sometimes referred to as string theory. And I say to my students, look, there's nobody in the police academy that's being taught to do design thinking or visualization, but when you look at these crazy walls, it's clear that using simple Gestalt principles, and primarily space in this case, and then interconnecting them, means that you can slowly start to externalize your thoughts, look for patterns, make sense of it, connect it, and boom. So it takes us back to the Charles and Ray Eames visual in the very beginning. So we could say that, whether you're a cop trying to decipher a crime or a criminal trying to plan a crime, rob a bank, you're going to sketch, you're going to visualize. The difference is that they're just on opposite ends of the spectrum. The cops are trying to figure out what the heck went on, whereas the criminals were busy planning it. But if we took the crazy wall and we just turned it into a diagram, it grows, just as the Eames's diagram suggested. It grows and it changes. And it allows us to see our thoughts and make connections in very specific ways. So it's never about the artifact. The crazy wall is ugly. We see it used both as a police procedural trope, but we also see it in the wacko, serial killer. The serial killer's got, a crazy wall in there. So they're both using it, but they're using it for different reasons. The other big thing that came out over the last couple of years in my research was this idea of, and I'll get into this a little bit more in more detail, but the notion that inside our brains, and this is not metaphorical, it's actual, we have both place cells and grid cells. And there's more coming up, so I'll hold off on that. And so I spend a lot of time looking at human cognition and specifically in vision, both in the first edition and then in the second edition, but in the second edition looking at trying to understand how some of these large transformer models work based on their ability to connect the next word or the next thing through an associational relationship or network. So the eye is a very interesting thing, and as a lot of people will point out, we've got natural bottlenecks that happen. One of the bottlenecks is short-term memory. We can only juggle, the old expression is 5 to 7, now they say it's more like 3 to 5. We can only juggle that relatively small number of elements for a very short period of time before they decay. And so this idea of getting your stuff out and not caring about what it looks like, but just getting it out so you've got it almost as a placeholder is super important. But the bottleneck, which I'll allude to in just a little bit, is essentially, you're turning a 10-lane highway into a 2-lane highway. So something's got to go. Something's got to give. Just more examples of trying to make sketching as physical as possible. So, to these critical bottlenecks, which are vision and short-term memory, and I just want to look a little bit at vision, and then I think I'm going to end up having to wrap up. So, when I started the first book, I remember thinking, because I'd seen my students struggle, I would sit down in that sort of Donald Chern protocol, and anybody who's not familiar with Donald Chern, he would sit down with an architect or two architects, and he'd ask the practitioner, the architect in this case, to verbalize what it is they were thinking as they were actually sketching. Which can be tricky. If we get to it, I did the same thing with a Dutch collaborator that I work with a lot in The Hague, and he sketched, and I asked him to talk through his process. And there were times where he said, "Kevin, I'm sorry, I just can't talk because I'm thinking too hard about what it is I'm doing." But so in the first book, I thought, well, if these students are struggling, and I've shown them and I've talked them through the protocol, like, why is it they can't figure this thing out? And so it made me think, well, maybe I need to understand more about vision. So I went down this crazy rabbit hole that I'm still in and will be in probably for the rest of my life, which is trying to understand human vision. And human vision, as V.S. Ramachandran points out, it's inside the brain. It doesn't happen. Your eyeball is just a lens that is directing data or signals, electrical charges on the back of your eye, but it's your brain that has to figure it out. And your brain is essentially in a black box. It's dark in there. So I always say to my students, we think of the eyeball analogous to a camera lens, it creates photos, or more realistically, a movie projector. But if that were the case, then even your little rangefinder camera wouldn't know what it's looking at. Now, I now say to my students in the last year or so, I'm going to guess that your camera will know what it's looking at, probably next year or the year after. But right now, your camera doesn't really know what it's looking at. So your smartphone, what it needs is, it needs edges. It needs hard edges. If you take a smartphone and you try to photograph a fuzzy cloud or a gray overcast day, your lens is just going to be doing this because it needs to grab onto edges. Humans need to grab onto edges. We see edges first, and then we fill in the detail. We're very good at recognizing silhouettes because they could be potentially dangerous to us. But smartphones at the moment, while they might be able to detect faces, are not particularly smart. So this is me, sent to Fractal NYC, and they turned it into a histogram of gradients. So this is how cameras that are doing facial detection, this is one of the ways in which they work. So it's a grid. It's a grid of little histograms that are showing you essentially hot and cold spots. So it's not an image of me, and yet when we see that image, it looks like me. But when you zoom in, you realize it's just a grid of data. So I'll be mindful. So I'll go through this, and then I'll just summarize it. It's always hard to take the amount of research and boil it into a 45-minute. So I tend to just speak as much as I can and then just stop. So this is one of the super interesting things about vision, is that those electrical signals in the form of light are hitting the retina, and they're going through through that little opening, which is your optic nerve, and it's going back to the visual processing area. Sorry, that jumped. That little optic nerve is a true bottleneck. And so again, while we'd accept this, we wouldn't accept this because it'd lead to this. But this is what's happening. You get so much data coming into your eye, and it's moving back through like an old school modem for those people who are old enough, before there was 3G, 4G, 5G, et cetera. That's kind of the way vision is working. So that little optic nerve has to push it back to the visual processing area in the back of your brain, and then your brain's going to push it back up front to where you make decisions, which are here. And there's a visual, there's a what and a where pathway, but mainly we rely on physics, we rely on theories of causality, we rely heavily on category in order to make sense of the world. But that one little bottleneck there, that optic nerve, reduces the flow of information exactly to the brain that needs it in order to understand vision. So I like to take this and say, there's your retina, and it's 100 million photoreceptors. Your optic nerve is 1 million fibers. So essentially, you can think of your eye as a very sophisticated high-end camera, and your brain is a little pinhole camera. And yet that's where a lot of the processing gets done. So this is for me the closest analogy, and obviously if you're super young you wouldn't get this, but for those of us who did get onto the internet the first time through a dial-up modem, that is essentially the way vision works. Like, there's no way to download a streaming video in reality. So what does the brain do? So while there are 1 million fibers that may seem faster than your internet connection, I'd say the new optic nerve, I'm jumping here a little bit, but I'll come back and then I'll summarize. I think as we see these numbers go up and up and up, we're really looking at a global, sort of mother optic nerve that's all going to go through our phones, but it's going to work in a way that makes us able to think better, but we're going to be totally reliant on the technology, which I think already is our other brain. So I'll finish up with this. In order to reframe all that data coming through, you can think of it in terms of I've invited 100 people and only 10 of them show up. So I have to throw away all of the excess food that I've prepared. And that's what the brain does. The brain throws away 95% of the incoming data simply because it can't process it. And this man here, Marcus Meister at Caltech, has a great talk where he describes exactly that. So there's so much data coming in, and yet we can't process it, so the eyeball just throws it away. How is the eyeball able to do it? And this is my ending, and then I'll give you a tiny little summary. The eyeball is actually, the retina in your eye is actually a piece of your brain. So when we think of the eye as a lens, it actually, that retina is a piece of your brain that's been pulled through that optic nerve, and it's been wrapped around the back of the eyeball, and it's making the executive decisions, saying, don't need that, don't need that, don't need that, don't need that. Oops, we definitely need that. It's literally processing 5% of the information coming in, which says to me that if you're making high fidelity sketches, they have nothing whatsoever to do with the realities of vision itself. So I'll end there, being respectful of time, and if there's any questions. If anybody wants this deck, I always love sharing, so I'd be happy to post it, make it available, but that's it.
And a microphone for the recording. You're probably getting this question a lot these days, but I love the description of process from low fidelity to high fidelity, and I'm dealing with this problem or question now myself. Where does generative AI fit into that line? Because I was thinking especially about your axes of fast to slow and low to high fidelity, and AI sort of confounds that, or I don't know where AI fits into that matrix.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, like, I'm sure, I think a lot of designers are dealing with this question right now, like what does
Yeah.
the generative AI mean to process?
It's a great question. So one of my arguments here is that I sketch in VR now, so I don't really need to understand how perspective works. I don't need horizon lines. I don't need vanishing points because I'm just sketching gesturally. When we think about AI, to me it says that front end, the low fidelity front end, that's the thing that AI doesn't do very well. My deck actually finished with some images from Viscom, and they're pretty terrible. But I think what AI is going to do is it's going to help us, one, get out of the gate. It's going to give us some scenarios. My big fear, especially with students, is that they could be overwhelmed. You know, if you throw a text prompt to DALL-E 3 and it gives you 35 images, you then have to look and say, well, which is the best one here? Because there's so many. So it's like the paradox of choice. If you've got too many choices, it's really hard to make a good one. So where AI, in my mind, fits in is it's a collaborator on both the earliest stages of that process, and it could be a collaborator on the back stages. I'm not sure at the moment if it sits in the middle yet, but it might. But I think the challenge will be, again, that as we generate a lot of stuff, we need better and better understanding of what constitutes a good image, as opposed to like, that's cool. Well, why is it cool? I don't know, it just looks really cool. And you're seeing, 30 of them or 60 of them or 90 of them, and you're going to need to go in and really be able to analyze it. And I think you're not analyzing it on that surface level. You need to be analyzing it on that much deeper level, which takes you back to, low fidelity, strategic testing, like where is it that we want to go? I think we're going to be so overwhelmed with the amount of data that we're able to generate that a lot of us are going to just we're going to be stressed out because there's just too many options. I don't know if that answers your question, but sure. Yeah. So for example, I sketch only on an iPad, partly because I taught during the pandemic, and that was like the only way to do it. So this is a quick little sketch that I then dropped into Viscom. And when you start to look at them, well, they're notoriously bad for dealing with hands. Now, if you're a designer of hand tools, the ergonomics of the hand is like crazy important. But here what we're getting is just visual junk. Now, this was a little ways back, but it was so easy. I really thought this was kind of interesting. It was so easy to generate that, again, I was back to this issue of like, well, I don't know, that's kind of cool, but do you really need a glove for a hand drill? And then you get these totally normal ones, and lots of them. And this one seems to be defying gravity. I don't know if there's some tail coming off that hand grip. But I put together this group of images just to show like how wacky some of this stuff is. Now, I think if you're doing stuff, there's a guy, an industrial designer who works for Crate and Barrel who does a lot of stuff. His Instagram handle is Longoland. He's in the book, and he's doing some pretty amazing stuff with Midjourney, but he's not trying to find a solution to a problem that is specific as this. He's doing it more as an exploration of kind of what-if scenarios. But I just kept doing it, and it just kept getting weirder and weirder. And so when you start to look and read about how these models are working, yeah, I think that's the other piece to your question is we're going to have to understand, we're going to have to open the black box of AI and understand some of what's happening in order for us to be productive. Otherwise, I think we're just going to become these monkeys that are producing a lot of stuff and then, making quote-unquote high-level decisions that might not be very sophisticated. But I think I did like 50, not including all of them. And I kept changing prompts, and to me it's just this strange mystery of like, how do I get this thing to do what I want it to do? So what I have seen, as I said, that I think is successful is when you're doing purely speculative stuff, and you're really just trying to create an ambiance or a feeling. But I think if you're trying to actually solve a problem, it's not working yet. But we can only imagine it's a matter of time.
Hey, I just wanted to add, and I've seen this now for quite a while, in our studio, for example, as technology has improved and it's become easier and easier to sort of create these super realistic images, there's this trend now of sort of regression back to the original sketch, where that's becoming much more appreciative, that like loose original sketch as opposed to the fancy sort of super realistic renderings. Sometimes honestly those get completely dismissed just because of all this new technology, and sometimes they lose the original idea. So it's really cool to kind of see this process. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, when we think about desktop publishing, late 80s, early 90s, there was this pendulum swing back towards traditional print methods, because suddenly people were like, yeah, it looks beautiful, but I don't like the way it feels. And so, most people these days are paying a lot of money for really high quality wedding invitations or anything that's printed matter. It's like it then comes to signify something that 10 years earlier they didn't really think about. So that the pendulum swing is always interesting.